Hey there, everybody. I'm Chris Metzler, one of the programmers here at SF DocFest. We're celebrating 20 years of bringing some of the more kind of interesting, eclectic, and independent films from around the world. This festival, I think when our founder, Jeff Ross, started it, he never imagined that 20 years later he'd be running this film festival with so many different great films. But, for those of you who don't know, SF DocFest started in an abandoned, kind of an empty church and down near Union Square is like 3 days of kind of interesting documentaries. And now we're 2.5 weeks of documentaries from around the world at Roxy and some other places around town. And so while we bring films from all around the world, it's always exciting when we're able to support Bay Area stories and filmmakers. And today we have the great film, Tell Them We Were Here. And we have the directors of the film, Griff Williams and Keelan Williams. Thanks again for being here, guys.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
When I first ran across the film and submissions, San Francisco has changed so much. I was just kind of curious about the story, but then, it was done in such a kind of an artful and interesting way and great film. It's I was like, okay, we need to figure out a way to share this with the Bay Area community. And what was the kind of genesis for going down this rabbit hole and knowing that you wanted to kind of make a documentary of this history and present day?
I think that one impetus behind wanting to make this was recognizing that the stories from the Bay Area's creative community is rarely told through the lens of San Francisco. It's quite frequently told through the lens of LA or New York. Artists gain notoriety and success here and then are kind of told through the lens of other more commercially rooted places. And we really thought that it missed the point of a kind of ethos that ran through a lot of the creative community here and felt like, while a lot of those sort of elements of that ethos, I think are disappearing in San Francisco. So the urgency to make the film now was in part to kind of honor the things that we think are maybe disappearing.
Yeah, it seemed to very much kind of a capturing a moment in time, one where things will inevitably change, and in which way they'll change, who knows? I mean, I think one of the interesting challenges of making a film about creative people and artists is, kind of aesthetic choices. So how did you all approach the kind of visual storytelling for the film and knowing what you wanted to capture, or was that something that you kind of discovered through the process?
I think Keelan and I really worked this very much in the way that as a kind of learning process. I mean, I don't think that we set out with a specific sort of style or storytelling device in mind. I think it was more a listening thing where we were really wanting to honor the stories of these artists who I think are doing remarkably interesting, creative things that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see as art.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film, the style of the film definitely was a result of a kind of reimagining of the story over and over as we were editing. We interviewed almost 60 artists in the process of making this film, and that presents a real challenge when you're making a film that's got to be a certain length. And we were really adamant about wanting to include artists that all had a kind of connective tissue to one another. And to do that, visually was a real challenge, but we had tremendous access through the artists' archives. They were really generous, letting us into their studios and letting us into their homes and into their businesses. And it was a real long process, but one that, I'm glad came together the way that it did.
How did you go about choosing the focus of who the kind of spotlight profiles would be?
Well, there was, like Keelan was saying, there was initially 60 people interviewed, all of which were remarkable artists in their own right. But San Francisco is also kind of a part of the story. It's another member of the cast in a way.
Mm.
And one of the things that we were wanting to do was to show it as a community of artists, a community of artists that are working on behalf of the sort of communal spirit that oftentimes is associated with this place. And so some of the artists that we were working with, studio practices didn't line up as neatly as others, and they were all very difficult editing decisions when you're cutting big chunks of things that you feel really strongly about. But I feel like the group that we ended up presenting in the film tells that story of the sort of community spirit of the place, I think, pretty elegantly.
And how did you both as kind of co-directors work together? And also, did you collaborate with the artists, or were they kind of hands off of kind of, tell the story that you want to tell in the creative way that you want to?
We worked really closely together. I mean, Keelan and I sat in a spare bedroom and edited this thing for 2 years. It was it was, it's not easy for somebody to be working with their dad on a movie.
Yeah, it was I mean, the collaborative process started, I graduated film school in May of 2017, and in June of that year, Dad was like, "You want to make a movie with me?" And I was like, okay. And didn't really understand what that meant. We didn't storyboard or fundraise. We just started making it. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how a lot of the artists in the Bay Area have operated for years, and how the place has operated. We do things ourselves. The kind of DIY spirit of the Bay Area, I think, was evident not only in the content of the film, but in the process of making it as well. We just shot on a camera that I bought from a friend of mine, and edited on a computer, as my dad said, in a spare bedroom.
And with the artists that you worked with, did they have any say, or did they basically, I mean, also, were they reticent at all about like telling their stories? I mean, obviously artists have to be somewhat self-promotional to get their work out there, but I could also imagine they're like, "Hey, look, I just want to focus on creating my work and building my community." And so how did they feel kind of, being interviewed and kind of sharing their story and what that involves in making a documentary?
I mean, that's a good question, Chris. Like, there's a lot of people who would have probably bristled with the idea that they weren't in control of the story. We were lucky to have chosen a bunch of artists that gave us a real wide berth in that respect. Like, the editing process was entirely ours, and honestly, I think the time that had elapsed between us interviewing people, I think a lot of these artists forgot we were even making a movie, or that they were included at all. So there wasn't a lot of over the shoulder sort of attention to the editing process. They all just were kind of excited to be connected with it.
Cool. In the takeaway, as we kind of are immersed in these different artists' story and the kind of community, is like, we're here in the Bay Area and amidst like lots of change. I mean, from the pandemic to the economy to just, life in general. And so what do you think the kind of biggest takeaway that you all have now after kind of weaving the story together that, you think we as a community should kind of keep in mind as we make our decisions as we go forward?
Well, like I said at the top, I feel like that there's the Bay Area is changing, and I don't necessarily think it's changing for the better. I think a lot of the eccentricities and communities that attracted us to this place originally are disappearing for obvious reasons, and the expense of living here, and the that's a story that I think probably could be told around the country, around the world. What I was hoping is that the underlying tenets in this film, the kind of the things that meant most to us was the idea that art and creativity has these enormous impacts on whatever community it happens to be, this isn't a story just about San Francisco. I mean, the story of San Francisco is definitely a significant part of this film, but I think you could make the case that the impact that artists and writers and musicians and creative people around the globe have on their communities is the takeaway, and those impulses to better a community through creativity, I think is a kind of universal one.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that. I think there was a moment, even relating to the conversation about editing, there was a moment when Tucker Nichols, in the interview we did, said something really poignant that didn't make the cut, but he was talking about the idea of, the Bay Area changing in a way that maybe it was not going to be, it's not going to allow artists to be artists any longer, right? Maybe they're moving away. And Tucker said that maybe it doesn't matter that people move away. Maybe it's okay as long as a community like that exists somewhere. As long as there's a place where young people can go and can feel free to experiment and fail and try new things and try to help people around them, that's okay. Maybe it doesn't have to be in the Bay Area. And that was something we struggled with a lot. Like, at first we were like, oh, that's just so sad. But in another way, I think it's really hopeful and beautiful. And I think, is a reality that we're all dealing with right now in the Bay Area.
And, when that comes to like filmmaking, Keelan, do you think you'll tell another story? I think you're based in Southern California, right?
Yeah.
Do you think you'll tell a story from LA, or is there kind of do you think you'll make another documentary, or is there, what other sorts of film projects do you have in mind at the moment?
Well, I mean, we're actually thinking about trying to, sort of expand the work that we've been doing with this film. As we said, we interviewed all these artists that didn't make the cut, and, the idea in screenwriting and in this business that, you have to kill your darlings sometimes to tell the story that needs to be told. In this case, the darlings are actually darlings of ours, real humans that we feel really strongly about. And there's a few little short films that have come out of a sort of the editing process that are almost done, that we're going to try to kind of package together and make a series out of. We're not quite sure, how that'll materialize, but we're working, to try to make some of that stuff happen, because we've got a wealth of material to continue this work that we've been doing. And I've got other projects here and there, but I feel really strongly about this one.
Well, very cool. Well, thanks again for you making the film and sharing it here with SF DocFest. Obviously excited to be sharing it in the virtual world, but also looking forward to the in-person screening at the Roxy, which in itself has its own kind of independent artistic celebration of things. So thanks again, Griff, and thanks again, Keelan, and have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot.